I never thought a single text message could make my hands tremble like that. 7 simple words: "You weren't invited to dinner, Mom." Yet they sliced through me sharper than any blade ever could. I must have read it 10 times, each word blurring a little more with every breath I took. The phone slipped from my hand, landing on the kitchen counter with a soft thud. The stew on the stove had begun to bubble over, the smell of rosemary and garlic filling the air his favorite. My son, Ethan. For years, Friday dinners were our tradition. No matter how busy life got, Ethan always came home. He'd sit in the same chair he did when he was 10, tapping his fork against the plate and teasing me for overcooking the rice the same way his father once did before the cancer took him. But now everything felt different. I wiped my hands on a towel and tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe his wife, Melissa, just wanted a quiet night. Maybe Ethan had phrased it wrong. He was a good boy, thoughtful, kind, the kind of son any mother would thank God for. After all, Melissa had always been polite enough to make her distance feel deliberate. She smiled in photographs, sent birthday texts, but there was a chill beneath her sweetness, a coldness I tried hard to ignore. I told myself she just needed time, that one day she'd see me as family too. I believed that, or maybe I just wanted to. The clock ticked past 6. Outside, the sun began to fade, spilling golden light across the quiet street. My house, once filled with laughter and late-night card games, now echoed with silence. I picked up the framed photo from the counter, Ethan in his graduation gown, my arm around his shoulder, his grin wide and proud. "I'm so proud of you," I whispered, like I did every time I felt the loneliness creep in. "You made it, baby, you made it." The photo wobbled in my hand as another vibration lit up my phone screen. This time, the words were colder. "Mom, please don't make this harder. Melissa just feels uncomfortable. Maybe next week." Uncomfortable. I sat down, the weight of those words pressing on my chest. I tried to remember when things changed, when I became someone his wife couldn't stand to be around. I thought back to that first dinner 2 years ago, right after their wedding. I'd spent all day cooking, setting the table with my best dishes. Melissa had arrived in a crisp white dress, her smile thin, her eyes scanning my modest home like she was cataloging every imperfection. When I handed her a plate of food, she thanked me, but only after taking a delicate sniff first. I brushed it off with a laugh. "It's just home, made chicken curry, dear, nothing fancy." She smiled again, but there was no warmth behind it. Later that night, I overheard her whisper to Ethan in the hallway, "Your mom means well, but she's a bit much." It stung, but I swallowed it like I always did. Since then, things had changed slowly, too slowly for me to see the danger creeping in. Calls from Ethan became shorter, visits less frequent. Melissa began forgetting to invite me to family gatherings, birthdays, even Christmas. Each time, Ethan would make up an excuse, promising to make it up next time. And I believed him because that's what mothers do. We believe in our children, even when the world tells us not to. But tonight felt different. Tonight, it wasn't Melissa's voice between us. It was his, my son. I looked around my small kitchen, the dinner I'd made now cooling on the counter. The soft hum of the refrigerator was the only sound left. I should have been angry, but instead I just felt empty. I reached for my apron, folding it neatly. Then, with a quiet resolve I didn't know I still had, I said to the empty room, "All right, Melissa, if that's how you want it." But deep down, something inside me stirred, something I hadn't felt since the day I buried my husband. A quiet, burning determination. Because I knew one thing for sure. If someone was trying to push me out of my own son's life, they were about to find out just how far a mother's love could go, and how dangerous it could become when betrayed. The days after that text were the kind that pressed at the edges of my life like damp, seeping through plaster, slow, invisible at first, then unmistakably there. I kept telling myself it was only a phase. People change, I said. New marriages come with new rhythms. But denial is a patient friend. It lets you sleep while it loosens the roof above your head. Ethan came by the following Tuesday, standing at my gate with a nervous stiffness I hadn't seen since he was a boy waiting for his school bus. He hugged me, quick and distracted, eyes flitting toward the car where Melissa sat, scrolling on her phone. The hug was polite, like an apology wrapped in distance. I invited them in anyway, I always did. It felt wrong not to. They sat in my living room like they were guests at a formal reception. Melissa's posture was perfect, prim and composed. She asked about my health, about the old photos on my mantel, but the questions were the sort you ask to fill silence, not to learn someone's heart. Every so often she'd exchange a look with Ethan that was precise, brittle a private language I could not translate. After tea, Melissa led Ethan into the kitchen, away from my hearing but not quite away from my sight. The front door clicked shut, and the hush between them felt loud. I pretended to be arranging the flowers on the table, the petals trembling under my fingers, and listened. "She'll take everything, Ethan," Melissa said in a low voice. The words were sharp but controlled, like a knife wrapped carefully in silk. "You can't let her interfere with how we're doing things. She means well, but it's too much. Her stories, her presence, it confuses people." Ethan's voice, usually so steady, sounded small. "I know, Mel. I'll handle it. Handle it." The word lodged in my chest like a stone. A few weeks later, a small conversation at my brother's house put another crack in the plaster. His wife, Fatima, mentioned casually over dinner that Melissa had asked her mother-in-law to limit my involvement with Ethan's daughter's school events. Fatima said it with the kind of idle gossip that seems harmless, not malicious, just a fact getting passed along like a folded note. "It's weird," Fatima said, stirring her coffee. "She told me she wants to keep things more private now. Said the in-laws bring unnecessary drama." Unnecessary drama. The phrase tasted of strategy, of a plan that had been rehearsed long before it was spoken. My heart thudded in my throat. I forced a laugh and changed the subject, but inside I felt the ground give way a little more. Then came the requests, small at first, with a softness that made them almost invisible. Melissa would suggest we not discuss money in front of Ethan because it makes him uncomfortable. She hinted that certain family decisions should be left to the couple alone. There was a tone to her words, a steady insistence that created new norms without asking. I found myself apologizing for my meals, my advice, my presence as though love came stamped with an expiry date. One afternoon, while tidying the guest room they used when visiting, I found a stack of envelopes tucked in the back of my wardrobe, unpaid bills, notices with my name and address. I remembered how last month I'd offered to help them with a small emergency expense. Ethan had thanked me and waved it off. Now, seeing those envelopes, the realization arrived like a cold wind. Perhaps I had been paying more for family than I thought. Perhaps my generosity had been mistaken for a cash flow to be counted on. I asked Ethan about it directly that night. We sat in the dim glow of the kitchen light, the clock measuring the silence between us. "Why didn't you tell me?" I asked. "If you needed help, we could have figured it out together." Ethan reached for my hand, fingers rough and distracted. "Mom, it's not like that. We can manage. Melissa and I, we're okay, really." But there was a hesitance in his eyes, a new carefulness, as if he were measuring how much of himself he could still give back to the family that raised him. He was being tugged between his wife's world and the one where he had grown up, and the tug was fraying him. Favoritism, I noticed, began to blossom in small, stinging ways. My sister-in-law's son, Karim, used to be family, part of our gatherings and Eid prayers. Lately, invitations to their house would arrive in glossy, formal messages except mine. I would see photos later of laughter and cake with captions like "family time," and my name would be absent. My brother would call and mumble an excuse. "Oh, Mujib, it slipped my mind. I'm so sorry." Slipped my mind. The phrase was becoming a refrain. At family functions, a subtle rearrangement was happening. Seats that once waited for me were now occupied. Conversations pivoted when I approached, moving to subjects I either did not understand or had no part in. The warmth that used to pool around me like sunlight thinned, and I found myself standing at the edge of rooms wondering when I had become the outsider in my own life. The most painful part was watching Ethan change in ways I could not name. He used to call me every morning to ask about my breakfast, to tease me about the soap I bought. Now his calls were scheduled, clipped "How are you, Mom?" Then I have to go. Even when he came over, he would answer Melissa's texts between bites, his attention divided like a map being cut. He smiled, but there was a new politeness in it, the practiced expression of someone learning to fit inside someone else's expectations. One night, I overheard a voicemail Melissa left on my daughter's phone, angry and decisive. "We can't have your mother involved with our plans," she said. "It's not appropriate." The words were like frost. My daughter called me, voice breaking. "Mom, did you know?" She asked. "No." I managed, and the lie felt heavy, a brick in my mouth. I wanted to say all the things I had always been. The cook who stayed up late rolling parathas for school lunches. The mother who woke in the night when the house cried. Instead, I found myself apologizing for having a life, as if loving my child made me a criminal. The unease grew when a small, insignificant incident at the bank unveiled a deeper strategy. I had gone to deposit some savings, coins I had been setting aside for a small holiday with old friends. The banker asked if someone could be listed as a secondary contact, for convenience. Without thinking, I mentioned Ethan's name. Later that day, Melissa called, voice tight with manufactured surprise. "Why is your son listed on your account?" she asked, as if I had asked the moon for permission to shine. "He's my son," I said, baffled. "It's just in case. He's family." "Well, it's not necessary. You should leave things as they are. We'll help if anything happens." Help, the word again, used like a hand on the steering wheel, guiding where my life could go. With every help, and it's for the best, a tiny decision was being made for me, rearranging my life to fit someone else's comfortable image of family. The pattern was surgical. Polite requests, slight manipulations, tests of my patience until resignations formed. It's strange how small cruelties are easiest to stomach. They come wrapped in manners and smiles, so you forgive before you name them. But cruelty is cruelty whether it arrives in a shout or a whisper. And those whispers began to coagulate into a story that did not include me. I tried to hold on to what I knew was true. The boy who used to run into my arms without looking. The family that gathered around small tables to share leftovers with gratitude. The man who once told me I'd taught him to be honest. Those memories were anchors, but anchors do not stop water from rising. At night, I began to dream of walls wallpapered, ornate walls curling away, revealing a blackness that smelled of old secrets. I would wake with my heart racing, the image of Melissa's hands rearranging my photographs in my mind, as if she were pruning a garden to remove undesirable blooms. So I started to keep a notebook. I wrote down every invitation I did not receive, every call that ended with an excuse, every cold smile and each whispered remark. The pages filled quickly. It comforted me to see the pattern spelled out in ink, a trail of small betrayals leading somewhere I could not yet see. And yet, even as the evidence grew, a part of me clung to hope. Perhaps it was a fight for my son's attention that could be won with patience. Maybe the warmth would return if I simply tried harder. Mothers are built of hope, of stubborn belief that their love can right any wrong. But hope can also blind you to the shape of danger until it is standing at your doorway, umbrella closed, waiting for you to notice the weather. I knew I had to be careful, not reckless, not dramatic. Observation, I told myself, was now my duty. If someone was taking advantage of kindness and rewriting our family for their comfort, I would trace the edits back to their source. I would not lash out and lose what little communication I still had. I would gather facts, I would prepare, quietly like a pot placed on low heat, simmering until the moment to boil was right. The cracks were there, and in their widening, they showed a pattern, favoritism, distance, quiet instructions delivered with sugar on the rim. But who was the architect? Melissa's practiced coolness, a sibling's convenience, my son's growing weariness, or some tangled alliance I had not yet imagined? I pressed my forehead to the pages of my notebook, and let out a breath that felt like surrender and determination in the same exhale. The storm was not yet here, but the air tasted different now, metallic, electric. I could feel the first hairs on my neck standing up. And for the first time since his father had died, I did not only feel love for my son. I felt the protectiveness of a woman who understood that sometimes love must become strategy to survive. The notebook on my bedside table had become heavier than the pillow beneath my head. Each entry was a pebble I'd dropped into a jar, small things that, when collected, made a weight impossible to ignore. I reread them that morning like a woman preparing herself to walk into a storm. Dates, names, overheard phrases, the times invitations never came. The ink trembled where my hand had once trembled. I told myself I would be careful. I told myself I would not believe the worst until I had proof. Proof arrived faster than I could breathe. It started with a letter, a crisp envelope stamped with the council seal. I thought it might be an invitation or a tax notice. When I opened it, my hands went cold. The letter said, in formal language that felt engineered to be cruel, that a petition had been filed to place me under temporary guardianship due to concerns for personal and financial well-being, and that a hearing had been scheduled for the following week. The petitioner was listed as E. Thompson, my son. I read the page 3 times, convinced it was a mistake. There was no mistake. Someone had signed a petition claiming I was unfit to manage my own affairs. The paper advised me to consult a lawyer, a luxury I did not have memorized numbers for, because for years I'd relied on family for everything. I sat down on the floor and let the house spin. When Ethan came over that evening, he stepped into the kitchen with the same careful anodyne tone he'd perfected, calm, reasonable. He took my hands and said, "We're worried about you, Mom. Melissa thinks it's best if we find someone to help manage things for a little while." "Who filed the petition?" I asked, even though I already knew. "We did." He said the word like a verdict. "We did it because we care." His eyes were dry. Melissa's voice from the doorway was cool and precise. "It's for your safety," she said. "You've been stressed. You've misplaced things. We just want to protect you." The betrayal did not click into place as one big slam. It unfolded like a slow, merciless unbuttoning. First came the subtle legal maneuvering. Signatures gathered by a neighbor convinced to say she'd noticed confusion. A medical note from a practitioner who'd never examined me but had filled in a form after a phone call. Then there were the bank calls, my account flagged for review, my savings temporarily frozen while an appointed guardian was established. When I rang the bank in a panic, they told me the request had come from my son. "Mom, it's only temporary," Ethan said, as if repeating the word might make it true. "We can help. We'll take care of things." I thought of the envelopes I had found in my wardrobe, the unpaid notices I had tucked away, and the small ways I had been nudged out of decisions. I thought of Melissa's help. I felt the floor beneath me tilt, and I could not hold my balance. The hearing was a humiliating procession. I sat in a courtroom with fluorescent lights that made everyone's skin paper thin. A lawyer spoke for the petitioners for my son, the man who had once tucked blankets around my knees. He read lists, missed appointments, a pattern of forgetfulness, the risk of financial mismanagement. I tried to speak, but my voice came out a little like the creak of an old door. "Please," I said, "I pay my bills, I cook my food, I water my plants, I know my life." The lawyer's pen scratched across the paper. "We have evidence of confusion," he said. "We have a neighbor's statement. We have financial inconsistencies." Ethan watched me from the other side of the room, eyes fixed and expression composed, like a man rehearsing grief. Melissa's fingers were interlaced with his under the table. In that moment, they looked like conspirators at a play's climax, and I, the woman who had raised him, was nothing but a prop in their scene. When the magistrate hesitated, balancing the weight of a mother's rights against the concerns presented, I felt a cold wind pass through me. He spoke of safeguarding and temporary care. He did not look at me when he said the words that would change everything. Until full assessment, temporary guardianship will be granted to the petitioners. My knees buckled. I remember the taste of the courtroom air, metallic, sharp. People murmur around me. A stranger touched my arm with well-meaning awkwardness. I was escorted to the clerk's office to sign acknowledgement. Forms I did not understand. Every signature felt like a nail. When I came home, a lockbox had been placed on my front door. A polite letter lay on the mat. For safety and administrative reasons, household access will be coordinated through appointed guardians. The paint on my door looked unfamiliar. My house, the place where my husband's laugh had once echoed, and my children had learned to tie shoes, now had barriers that felt as physical as they were legal. The financial stickers arrived soon after. My account, the small savings I had tucked away, had been transferred into a joint account with Ethan and Melissa as signatories. The bank said it had to do this to protect me. They had taken keys to my car, citing insurance concerns. Someone changed the contact number on my medical records to Ethan's mobile. Each administrative act was a quiet theft. I suppose most people imagine betrayal as a spat of shouting, a back turned in anger. But this was quieter, surgical, an erasure executed in polite forms and paperwork. They had weaponized care. I tried to call my daughter. She would not answer. My brother's voice, when he finally spoke, was small and ashamed. I was called as a witness, he said. I didn't want to sign anything. They were very persuasive. Persuasive. There it was again, the velvet glove that masked force. That night I stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where I had once kneaded dough while humming songs into the air, and I let the cry come. It started as a drip behind my eyes and turned into something volcanic, a grief that was not only for what I had lost, but for the idea that the boy who had once climbed into my lap for comfort could now consent to remove my name from the things that anchored me to the world. What did I do? I whispered to the empty room. There was no answer. I packed a small bag, partly out of habit and partly to hold on to something tangible in a life that had been hollowed out. A photo of my husband. The necklace he had given me years ago. The notebook with the list of slights, as if ink and memory might be ammunition. The next morning, a car I did not recognize pulled into my driveway. Two people in neutral suits approached my porch with clipboards and a professional calm. "We're here to assist with transition," one of them said. "We have a schedule to follow." I opened the door and let them in because what else could I do? The house felt like the set of a play I had been asked to leave. They took inventory of my belongings with brisk efficiency. "We need to pack certain items for safekeeping," they said. "It will be easier this way." They boxed up my husband's watch. They removed my gardening tools and my old recipe books. They wrapped the framed photos in paper as if the faces in them were fragile artifacts rather than living memories. I watched them carry pieces of my life out and place them in the trunk of a car with businesslike precision. Ethan stood by, hands folded as if attending a solemn ceremony. Melissa's eyes were dry. She did not look at me. "Mom," Ethan said, his voice soft, the same script as always. "We have to do what's best." "Best for who?" I managed to ask, though the words felt small and raw. He looked at me then, and in that look I saw a distance I could not cross. The son who had once scraped his knee on my porch and shivered against my chest now looked like someone who had rehearsed a goodbye. And then, because life is cruel in its timing, the phone in my pocket buzzed. A message. I took it with fingers that suddenly felt like someone else's. It was from an unknown number. "We served eviction notice, effective immediately." For a moment, sound left the world. The room spun. My hands flew to my mouth. I could taste the metal again. I turned to Ethan. He didn't move to console me. He only said quietly, with great and terrible finality, "We thought it would be better if you had a quieter place to stay. There's a facility nearby." I fell back into a chair as if the air had been stolen from me. My room seemed suddenly too large, too empty. My husband's watch ticked in its box. Outside, someone was folding the cardboard into neat squares. They had cut me out of my life with legal scissors, and wrapped the act in the language of love. The hurt was not only that they had taken things from me. It was that the people who had pledged to hold my heart now saw that heart as a risk to be managed. I pressed my fist against my ribs as if to stop the ache and whispered into the hollow where warmth had been, "Ethan." Why, he met my gaze for a heartbeat, then looked away. "We're doing this for your good," he said, and the words fell like an accusation. I opened my notebook and slapped it down on the table. The ink stared back in neat rows. I had proof now not only of omission and coldness, but of action. Pages that would be read by someone who could wield them. Outside, the car door slammed. The men in suits loaded the last box into the trunk and closed it with a click that sounded like a final seal. I stood in the kitchen as my life, or what had been my life, was driven away. Then Ethan leaned in close, voice soft, as if delivering a final mercy and sharp as a blade, and said the one line that splintered the world in two before and after. "We did what had to be done, Mom. You'll thank us later." The renter room smelled faintly of lemon disinfectant and someone else's perfume. The bed creaked when I sat on it, protesting the weight of a woman who had once carried more than she let anyone see. In the corner, a mug with a faded cartoon animal sat on a chipped saucer. It was not my kitchen. Nothing in the room knew the rhythm of my hands. I unpacked the small bag I had brought, a photograph, a necklace, the blue notebook now frayed at the edges, and set them on the tiny bedside table like a makeshift altar. For 2 days I moved through the hours like a shadow. Meals arrived at set times. There were other residents, kind enough in that institutional way, nodding at each other across television light. People here meant well, the staff were efficient, sympathetic. But there was a hollowness that no one could fill. The world outside the door continued, indifferent to the fact that my life had been carved into pieces and parceled out. On the third morning, a volunteer with soft eyes and volunteer badge called my name and sat across from me with a cup of tea. "How are you settling in?" she asked. Her voice was gentle, but there was nothing in it that suggested pity, only the plain human question of whether someone else could be helped. "How am I settling?" I asked, and the question tasted like ash. "They took my house, my savings. They said it was for my good." She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she reached into her bag and took out a small envelope. "Somebody left this for you," she said. Inside was a grocery receipt and a sticky note. The note read, "Saw what happened. I remember your son when he was little. He used to chase pigeons at the park. Don't give up, a neighbor." The handwriting was in a hurried scrawl, smudged along the edges, but the words were steady. I read it 3 times. The memory came back with the force of sunlight through glass. Ethan, small and laughing, his shoes scuffing in the dust, my hands pinning his coat as he ran toward the pigeons. I could hear him calling, "Mama, Mama." And the world had been that simple, then my world and his, stitched together by small, ordinary joys. That picture, that note, did something inside me that nothing Melissa's calm words or the magistrate's papers had managed. It was not an awakening of hatred. It was a reawakening of identity. I had not been put here to be managed into invisibility. I was a woman with a history, relationship, memory, a lifetime of loose ends and loving labors that did not dissolve because someone decided they should. Later that day, an insult reached me that should have been the last straw, but instead lit a lantern. A social worker, trying to be clinical, explained that many families preferred a safer environment for elders who needed supervision. She said it as if she'd invented a courtesy. "You'll be in good hands," she said. The room felt suddenly colder. I thought of my husband's hands, rough from work, and the way he used to tuck my hair behind my ear and say, "You are the heart of this family." The memory was a bell that rang me awake. I realized then that anger alone would not serve me. Anger is a bright flame, but it burns you too if you do not control it. What I needed was clarity. I began, very quietly, to collect the small things that had become my tools. First, I retrieved the notebook. The pages were dense with ink, dates, names, heard phrases, receipts, the list of invitations I never received. It was my ledger of wrongs, but it was also proof. I copied the most important entries onto loose sheets of paper, numbering each one carefully. The act of writing steadied my hands. Each line I transcribed transformed memory into evidence. Then I walked to the small public library down the street, leaning on a borrowed cane, more for the dramatic effect than the need I wanted to walk with purpose. The librarian, a stern woman with spectacles, gave me a station at a computer and a privacy that felt like a small victory. I searched for legal aid clinics, elder rights organizations, community advocates. There were pamphlets about guardianship law, plain language guides that mentioned rights and procedures. I printed a page that explained the criteria for temporary guardianship and the rights of the person named in the petition. The words on the page read like permission: you have the right to counsel, you have the right to request reassessment, you have the right to present evidence. Armed with these papers, I made another crucial choice. I would not plead or beg. I would present. There is a difference. Pleading asks for mercy. Presenting demands recognition. I would become a force of facts, meticulous, patient, and relentless. My first step was to call every friend and family member who might still remember the woman I had been before policies and petitions reshaped me. Some calls ended with awkward silences, others with sorrowful apologies. My sister cried and said she had been confused at the time. My brother admitted he had been pressured and was ashamed. My daughter's voice came shaking through the line. "I'm so sorry, Amma. I didn't know how to fight them." Her apology was clumsy and hollow, and also the very thing that began to knit me back together. When I told my daughter about the notebook, she asked to see it. She read, and then, with a sound like a choke, asked, "Why didn't you tell me everything?" I could only say, "I thought I was protecting you all." Regret is a difficult inheritance to carry, but at least it meant the lines of communication were reopening. Neighbors began to call. The woman from the sticky note, whose name I learned was Mrs. Khan, brought over a small plate of samosas and a thick folder of photocopied emails and text messages she had kept because she had always liked the family's photos in the stairwell. "I don't trust those people," she said simply. "You deserve better." Evidence accumulated like a flock. A neighbor's recollection of Melissa asking her to keep certain people out. An old text from Ethan promising to come for dinner the week before the petition. A bank statement Mrs. Khan had kept after helping me balance my accounts years ago. It was small, cobbled support, but it mattered. People's memories are fragile things, but when they speak together, they form a structure that a single legal claim cannot easily erode. Meanwhile, I learned to tend to my own heart. Each morning I walked to the little park where pigeons still gathered, and I sat on the bench and watched the children run. I listened to my breath. The world was indifferent, yes, but it was also full of witnesses. The act of being seen by others, by strangers who could testify that I existed and had once existed in a particular role, became a quiet balm. In those walks, the desire for revenge sometimes flickered dark and hot, and I acknowledged it without letting it rule me. That hunger was human. It was not who I wanted to be. What I wanted was justice. I wanted to be recognized as a person, not a case file. I wanted my name uncrossed from deeds and ledgers, my voice returned to family tables. I wanted dignity. I made one more strategic choice: to speak where they could not silence me. I drafted a simple letter, 1 page, factual and restrained, recounting dates and actions, requesting an immediate reassessment of the guardianship and restoration of access to my home, and asking for a hearing in open court with witnesses. I signed it with the same hand that had once written grocery lists and love notes and recipes. Then I took it to the legal aid clinic the librarian had helped me find. The lawyer there smelled of coffee and law books. He read my notebook, then the loose sheets. He did not promise miracles. He promised to file for an emergency review and to subpoena witnesses. He said, plainly, "They can't erase you with paperwork alone if you fight back with truth." On my way out of the clinic, clutching copies of newly filed documents, a boy on a bicycle skidded past and nearly knocked me over. He looked up, embarrassed, and then something in his face, a flash of recognition when I smiled apologetically, made me laugh. It was a small, ridiculous sound, but it felt like air returning to my lungs. That night, as I lay on the narrow bed, I placed the blue notebook beside me and stroked the photograph of my husband. I thought of the life that had taught me how to keep going, collecting, mending, forgiving, and insisting. I had been stripped of much, but not of my name, my memory, or my capacity to act. I closed my eyes, and for the first time since the eviction notice arrived, I did not feel like a person being carried away by a tide. I felt like someone who had found a map. The path ahead would be long and tiring, but it was a path I could walk with my chin up. Somewhere down the road, I knew, the confrontation would come again. I would stand in a room with my son and the papers that had made him into my adversary, and I would ask him, in a voice steady and clear, how he had learned to measure love by convenience. For now I gathered my papers, my witnesses, my small band of allies, and the stubborn ember of a vow. I would reclaim not just my house, but my story. I would not be managed out of the narrative I had written with my hands. As sleep came, it did so thin and fierce, like a promise. The notebook lay open on the bedside table, and under the lamplight, the ink shone black and definitive. Tomorrow, I would begin to make them answer. The world outside the little renter. Room hummed with indifferent life. Shopkeepers sweeping their stoops, children shouting, the mosque speaker calling midday prayers. Inside, my life had been reduced to a stack of papers and a small blue notebook, but the notebook was no longer only a record of wrongs, it was the skeleton of a plan. I learned early that fury without direction is like a river without banks. It floods, it destroys, and then it leaves you with mud. What I wanted was not to drown anyone. I wanted a river with purpose, one that would cut clean and reveal the bedrock under falsehood. So I and my small legal team set the banks. The lawyer from the clinic, a thin, pragmatic woman named Aisha, taught me how the law could be a scalpel. We will not shout, she said, we will show. Paper, witness, timeline. She explained the process in clear, patient sentences and then placed a folder of forms in my hands. We'll subpoena bank records, medical notes, any communications. We'll call witnesses. We'll show motive and method. Motive, I realized, was the thing that made betrayal more than an accident. Melissa had wanted control of invitations, decisions, money, and, apparently, of my name. That need left traces. People leave traces. The first step was practical. Consolidate evidence. I copied bank statements, receipts, and the letters that had arrived like grenades. Mrs. Khan came by with photocopies of texts she had saved, and photographs she'd taken from the stairwell when Melissa and Ethan met with a woman in a suit outside my house one afternoon. I thought it was a real estate agent, Mrs. Khan admitted, but later, after I heard, I kept the pictures. Those pictures were small and grainy, but to Aisha they were lines of code. We'll get phone records, she said. We'll match dates. She drafted subpoenas and filed them with a quiet efficiency that felt like strategy in motion. Next came witnesses. People are often the best proof because they speak truth without the artifice of forms. I visited neighbors, the grocer who remembered the day Melissa had asked him to keep quiet about invitations, the teacher from the school who'd noted my presence at a recital and later realized she hadn't been invited to the family event where I'd been absent. Some were hesitant at first. Loyalty and fear are a powerful glue. But when you ask for the truth gently and with purpose, people will risk discomfort for what is right. While Aisha worked her legal channels, I set another, quieter plan in motion, one that relied on human temperament more than law. People who keep lies need sympathy and cover. I decided to remove both. Melissa's arrogance was a useful tool. She assumed the petition, and the locks had silenced me. She posted photos online, polished dinners, crisp invitations, captions about family unity. Her smile in the pictures was the kind of polished calm that comes from believing you have removed an obstacle. She was careless in her triumph, so I cultivated appearances of my own small, public, and impossible to ignore. I began attending community events. I volunteered at the library's storytelling hour. I joined the women's sewing group that met on Wednesdays. And I visited the school parent-teacher association, where I once used to help with biscuits and decorations. At first, Melissa's allies sniffed. She's making a show. But too many witnesses seeing me active, present, coherent, and engaged made the confused elder story harder to sustain. One afternoon at the PTA meeting, a woman approached me quietly. "My son, Karim, he was at your Eid once," she said. "I didn't think you'd been excluded like that." She then added hesitantly, "I have CCTV from when Mrs. Thompson visited the community center and met with an older man who later signed a form about your confusion." Her voice dropped. She handed me a USB stick like it was contraband. I took it home with hands that did not tremble. The footage was raw, Melissa arriving, talking closely with a man whose resemblance to an elder neighbor startled me. The man nodding and signing something in a binder. The timestamps matched an affidavit that had been presented in the guardianship papers. The image did not explain everything, but it suggested orchestration. Aisha arranged for a forensic analysis. The lab would confirm timestamps and authenticity. The USB stick became a small thundercloud in a folder of files. At the bank, Aisha's subpoenas produced more than I expected. Emails between Melissa and an employee, odd memos suggesting expedited processes, and a note about a family concern, filed under my account. It was bureaucratic language, but it smelled of coordination. When stitched together with the witness statements the neighbor who'd been asked to sign, the woman who'd met Melissa at the community center, the grocery owner who kept the receipts, it started to look like a pattern rather than a coincidence. We also planned emotional traps not to humiliate, but to give truth a stage. A public hearing, I learned, carries a weight of its own. People in a room listen differently than people reading a paper. I filed a request for a public reassessment hearing and asked for witnesses to be permitted. The court granted it with a curt efficiency that felt like a small victory. Meanwhile, Melissa's arrogance grew. She continued to organize family brunches without inviting me and posted photos with captions that read like a taunt. Ethan's face in the pictures was polite, practiced a man who had learned to present grief like a performance. He answered my brief messages with a professionalism that stung. "We're doing what's best," he wrote, and sometimes I would imagine him repeating it in the mirror until the words felt true to him. That complacency made them sloppy. A maid who worked for Melissa's neighbor, overhearing a private call, called me with trembling urgency and offered to testify that she'd been asked to keep an eye for certain documents. A delivery receipt surfaced where Melissa had ordered legal forms and couriered them to a P.O. box not listed on any family file. The more they tried to solidify, the more they left footprints. I kept my own face neutral. I met Aisha's deadlines, signed forms, showed up to interviews and clinics. I practiced the small performance of ordinary life, a cup of tea with a neighbor, a laugh at the sewing group, while beneath it all, the scaffolding of evidence rose. I learned to breathe through fear and to carry my indignation like a folded coat until it was needed. The nights were the worst. I wrote letters I did not send and practiced my statements in front of the mirror until my voice was steady. But there were also small consolations. A note from my daughter saying she'd be there, the neighbor who dropped off samosas and told me not to worry. The way pigeons still flocked in the park as if some things in the world remained true. The day before the hearing, Melissa posted a photograph of herself in a salon chair. Perfect hair, perfect smile, captioned, "All for the family. Sometimes tough choices are the kindest ones." The message was thinly veiled triumph. She believed herself untouchable. When I sat across from Aisha that evening, we went over the list of witnesses one more time. There was Mrs. Khan with her receipts, Mrs. Iqbal from the PTA with the CCTV, the grocer, the maid, and most painfully, my brother, whose shaky testimony we had turned into an act of contrition that could highlight how pressurized people had been. We had the bank emails, the courier receipts, the community center footage, and the neighbor affidavits. It felt like a small army of ordinary people who had decided truth was worth saying. "Remember," Aisha said, placing her hand over mine. "You don't need to yell, you need to be seen. I slept poorly and dreamt of doors opening. When morning came, the world seemed to hold its breath. I put on the dress my husband had liked, a simple blue one that made me sit straighter. I tucked the notebook into my bag, the neat stack of printed evidence inside like a talisman. On the courthouse steps, I saw faces, neighbors in their shawls, the librarian who had given me the printouts, Mrs. Kahn with a small cloth bag of homemade sweets, my daughter's hand in mine, shaking but present. They were not many, but they were witnesses who had chosen to stand in the light. Melissa arrived later, in a car that gleamed. Her smile was practiced. Ethan stood at her side, more composed than I'd seen him since childhood. They paused to pose for a photo with relatives gathered like a shield. They believed the picture would be the last word. Inside the packed courtroom, we took our places. Papers rustled. The magistrate called the room to order. Aisha rose and moved through her opening with the calm of someone who has watched a plan take shape and is finally ready to unveil it. She called witnesses. She introduced emails, timestamps, receipts, and the community footage that made heads turn. When she finished her opening, I felt something that was not triumph, but a long, exhaled relief. The plan had begun. The river had found its banks and now flowed toward the sea. Outside the window, the sun slid between clouds, and in the corridor a small phone vibrated with a message. From an unknown number, "We've just uploaded the full footage." I read it, and something cold and thrilling uncoiled inside me. Melissa had not expected this. Her confidence had been a cloak. Now the cloak was slipping. And in the hush that followed, as witnesses rose and witnesses prepared to speak, I realized the storm I had been building was not a spectacle of malice. It was a reclamation, quiet, lawful, and inexorable. The courtroom doors opened and a hush fell. Then, through the doorway, walked someone whose presence would tilt the scales, someone Melissa never thought to call to the stand. The courtroom hummed like a held breath. Papers rustled, shoes scuffed, pens clicked against legal pads. Faces watched, some curious, some sympathetic, some already whispering the verdict of human hearts. I felt my daughter's fingers tighten around mine, and for the first time in weeks, I did not feel alone. Aisha stood and moved with the quiet authority of someone who had rehearsed every corner of truth until it could not be denied. "Your Honor," she began, "we will show the court a sequence of actions that were neither benevolent nor benevolent in intent, but coordinated, documented, and actionable." She called the first witness, Mrs. Kahn. The old woman shuffled forward in her shawl, eyes fixed on the magistrate. She spoke plainly about the courier receipts, the photos she'd taken of Melissa meeting with the man who later signed an affidavit about my confusion. Then the PTA coordinator, who had handed me the USB, laid the community center footage on the court's monitor. The room leaned in. On the screen, Melissa appeared, smiling and animated, talking closely with an elderly man who signed a paper. He hesitated, then pressed his thumb to the signature line. A timestamp ticked in the corner. It was the same date a so-called medical note had been submitted. The footage showed Melissa leaving with a small envelope. The grainy image had the blunt force of evidence. A hush spread. Melissa's jaw tightened. She looked as if someone had shown her a mirror she did not expect to find. Ethan's hand went slack. The magistrate's pen paused above his docket. Then Aisha played the bank emails. One message from a bank employee to another, read, "Expedite guardianship paperwork per family request. Client Melissa Thompson. Mark urgent." Another memo referenced a phone call and a family concern, placed on my account at Melissa's request. The bureaucratic language looked suddenly sinister. Objection, and Melissa's lawyer snapped, but the magistrate overruled. The court accepted the documents. The narrative stitched itself. Coordination, persuasion, a pattern that was not coincidence but a strategy. Next, the maid's testimony sealed a different kind of betrayal. She described being asked to look for certain papers in my flat and to keep an eye on things while Melissa met with people. Tears came to her eyes as she confessed how uncomfortable she'd felt and how she had been paid extra to stay silent. She recounted a call where Melissa coached her on what to say if questioned. The word coaching landed hard like the click of a lock. The prosecutor then produced the forensic report on the USB footage and the timestamps. The lab confirmed the file's authenticity. The metadata showed edits and movements that matched the timing of the affidavits. It was not only what was shown, but when and how. You could not easily claim coincidence when the calendar and the cameras both pointed to orchestration. Aisha saved the final, most devastating piece for last. She called my brother to the stand. I had begged him not to, worried he'd crack under pressure. He'd insisted, hoarse with guilt, that he could not keep silence any longer. He walked up with a shuffling gait, cheeks raw. When he faced the room, he looked much older than the years would suggest. He put me under pressure, he said, voice trembling. They told me they were doing what was best. Melissa said she'd handle everything if I would just sign the statement. I thought we were protecting her. I didn't want to break my son's confidence, and I'm ashamed. The words splintered the tableau. My son's name was no longer merely that of a loved one. It was tethered to the act that placed my life behind locks. Ethan's face collapsed then, a structure eroding. He had been the architect of the petition on paper. My brother's admission made clear he had been more of a witness to persuasion than an independent actor. The magistrate leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson," he said, "are you now suggesting coercion in the collection of these signatures?" My brother nodded, tears spilling. "Yes. I was asked to sign after being shown documents in a way that made me believe it was necessary. I was told to sign it for Emma's safety. I realize now I was wrong." The courtroom seemed to slow. Ethan's shoulders reached for the ceiling and then sagged. He stared at his hands as if they were foreign objects. Melissa's composure cracked like glass. For the first time, she was unmasked in a way pictures and posts could never show. A woman who had orchestrated a removal and then insisted it was mercy. Then came the live upload. A young neighbor, summoned by Aisha, handed a phone to the court clerk. "We uploaded the full footage last night," she said quietly. "It's on a secure server. The public can access it if the court permits." The clerk tipped his head towards the monitor, and, with a click, the fuller footage began to play. This was not just a staged encounter. It was a trail, messages instructing certain neighbors to attest to confusion. A courier receipt with Melissa's initials, a delivery note showing legal forms delivered to a P.O. box registered to a shell company. Melissa's voice appeared, recorded in a clip where she negotiated with a so-called assessor about fast tracking the petition. Her voice was crisp, confident, and devoid of remorse. Gasps traveled through the room like a wave. A man in the back muttered, "She's been playing everyone." Cameras, reel and phone, tilted toward her. Her relatives shifted, suddenly aware they were not witnessing someone stepping into noble duty, but someone executing a strategy. Ethan's face broke as if struck. He swallowed, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a ragged thing. "I thought I was helping," he said. "I didn't know I didn't see. You were shown the path." My brother interrupted. "They guided us." The magistrate's hand came down like a gavel in my chest. He reviewed the evidence, the chain of custody, the witness statements. Given the new evidence of manipulation, coercion, and possible fraud in the procurement of the guardianship petition, he said, "This court hereby orders an immediate suspension of the temporary guardianship. Furthermore, this matter will be referred for criminal review regarding possible fraud and coercion." The words landed like rain on parched earth. Relief swelled inside me until it threatened to burst, but alongside it came a different, sharper sound. The sound of betrayal hitting the floor. People around the room stared at Melissa with a new clarity. Her world, built of curated dinners and curated photos, was disassembling before her eyes. Outside, the courthouse steps became a press stage. Reporters gathered as the story unfolded beyond the courtroom glass. Melissa's social media fell silent for the first time in weeks. The comments on her last triumphant post became a chorus of disbelief and accusation. The viral clip of her negotiating the petition, now out of court and online, did what the papers and witnesses had started. It made her actions public, unavoidable. Ethan turned to the gallery, voice shaking. "Mom, he could not finish. He reached for me as if to steady himself, but the distance he had opened between us was not something hands could bridge in a single gesture. I stood then. The room watched a woman whose life had been dismantled, watch another woman, her mother, stand. I felt my legs steady beneath me. I had prepared for this not because I wanted spectacle, but because I wanted truth. Now I had it. Melissa's lawyer sputtered indignantly, then sank as the tide turned. Somebody said, sotto voce, there'll be charges. Somebody else whispered, how could she? My daughter cried openly, and neighbors crowded round, offering small comforts. My brother wept and tried to say apologies that landed like soft stones. Ethan stood, hollowed and raw, and his eyes met mine with a grief that cut deeper than anger. I'm sorry, he said, and those were words, at last, not rehearsed but born of collision. Outside, a camera light winked, and the world began to take in what the court had witnessed. Justice, when it arrives, is often messy and incomplete. But that day it was a bright, uncompromising light. The temporary guardianship was suspended. My accounts were to be unfrozen pending audit. The eviction notice lay legally impotent while the court issued a stay. As people streamed out of the courtroom, some offering condolences, others shaking their heads in shame at the fabrications, Melissa was escorted from the room by her lawyer, shoulders slumped, face a study in unraveling composure. Her followers would digest the footage and the testimony, and over time, the curated narrative she had built would be replanted with a very different story. I felt the air change as if a window had been opened and stale breath pulled out. The price of truth had been paid in pain, but it had been paid nonetheless. I had asked for recognition, and recognition had come wrapped in paperwork and witness testimony, and the courage of ordinary people willing to stand. On the courthouse steps, reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed like summer lightning. Ethan moved closer and said, barely audible, I never wanted this to hurt you. His words were small, and the hurt was monstrous, but there is work to do after a storm. There is rebuilding, there is reckoning, there is sometimes a chance for what was broken to be made honest. As I descended the steps, the sunlight hit my face. For the first time in weeks, the world did not feel like a stage set by other people. It felt raw and real and filled with consequences. And as Melissa's car pulled away, her hands white on the steering wheel, I realized the final thing that made the courtroom's verdict feel true. It wasn't vengeance that had driven me here. It was a plain, stubborn insistence that my life, not their narrative, be allowed to exist. Ethan watched her go, and his shoulders slumped. He looked at me, and in his eyes I saw the boy who had chased pigeons in the park, blinking into adulthood too quickly. Amma, he whispered, and the word carried regret and apology like a fragile bird. I looked at him and at the woman he had married, no longer untouchable, suddenly exposed. And I understood that some reckonings break before they heal. The storm had hit, the glass lay shattered. Now we would have to sweep it up together, or else leave it where it lay. The world had watched them fall. Now it was time to decide what would rise from the ruins. The days after the hearing felt strangely still. The legal formalities continued, papers signed, letters delivered, accounts slowly thawing back into my control. But inside me, something else was unfolding, not just relief, but a quiet rebirth. For years, I had been told that silence was dignity, that patience was strength. But I had learned that sometimes silence becomes complicity and patience, a slow burial. Now I spoke when I needed to. I moved with calm purpose. The house I had been pushed out of still stood where I left it, same pale curtains, same creak in the front step. But when I crossed the threshold again, escorted by an officer with the reinstated court order in his hand, I didn't rush to touch the walls or cry. I stood there for a long moment and just breathed, the scent of dust, faintly floral detergent, and memory mixed in the air. I ran my hand along the old wooden table, the one I'd scrubbed 1,000 times after Ethan's school projects, after family dinners, after birthdays that once filled the room with laughter. Now, the house was empty yet full of ghosts that had finally stopped whispering. Melissa vanished from the community almost overnight. Her glossy smiles and social media posts disappeared as if erased by the very truth she had tried to bury. The footage, the testimony, the bank records, all of it had gone viral in whispers and forwarded links. People who had once adored her polite charm now looked through her, speaking her name only in lowered tones. The company she worked for politely accepted her resignation. Her friends distanced themselves. The house she had decorated for perfection now echoed with absence. Ethan stayed for a time, but it was clear the foundation beneath them had cracked beyond repair. Trust is a fragile thing once it shatters. No amount of glue can make it hold again. One evening, weeks later, I heard a knock at my door. It was him. He stood there, smaller somehow, the arrogance gone. The boy I remembered flickering through the exhaustion on his face. His eyes were rimmed red. He looked like someone who had been standing in the rain too long. "Emma," he said softly, "I don't even know where to start." I let him in. The same kitchen where betrayal had begun now felt like a confessional. He sat at the table, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. "I thought I was doing the right thing," he said. "She made me believe you were slipping, that you were getting lost. I wanted to protect you. I didn't see what she was doing until it was too late. There was no anger left in me. Only a kind of tired understanding that pain often disguises itself as good intention. People see what they are told to see, Ethan." I said quietly, "But truth waits. It doesn't need to shout, it just stands where it is until someone opens their eyes." He cried then, the way he hadn't since he was a child. I let him. Tears are sometimes the first language of remorse. In the following months, life rebuilt itself in unexpected ways. My daughter moved closer. The neighbors who had once watched from a distance now stopped by for tea. The sewing group I'd joined at the shelter invited me to lead their community project, "We Need Your Calm Energy." One of them said, "It felt good to be needed for something honest." The court's final ruling arrived one bright afternoon. Full restoration of property, bank accounts, and independence. A single line at the bottom read, "All allegations of incapacity proven unfounded." The signature below it gleamed like justice itself. And though Melissa faced charges for fraud and coercion, it was not her punishment that satisfied me most, it was the silence that followed her name. The kind of silence that only truth can create. She had built her life on appearances, and now she was invisible. Weeks later, I visited the park where Ethan used to chase pigeons. He joined me there quietly, a paper bag of breadcrumbs in his hand. We didn't talk much. Words between us now were slow, careful, tender like newly planted seeds. A group of children ran past, laughing, the same sound that had once belonged to him. He threw a handful of crumbs, and for a moment the pigeons scattered and circled back, landing near our feet. "Do you think she'll ever forgive me?" he asked finally. I looked at the birds, their wings catching sunlight like fractured glass. "I think forgiveness isn't a gift we give others," I said. "It's the peace we decide to live with." He nodded, his face turning away, but I saw the relief in the small tremor of his breath. Months turned into a year. The house, once a battlefield, became a home again. I filled it with life plants, laughter, the smell of cardamom tea. The neighborhood children called me Auntie again. My name, once erased from legal papers, found its way back onto envelopes and hearts alike. And sometimes, in the quiet evenings, I'd sit on the porch with the blue notebook now closed, its pages full of pain and proof. It had served its purpose. The final entry I wrote was not about betrayal, but about becoming. You cannot destroy what was built on truth. You can only delay its light. Melissa's story traveled further than she intended. People whispered, yes, about the fraud, the court case, the video. But whispers fade. What remained was something else, her loneliness. Her arrogance had cost her everyone, her reputation, her friends, her husband. I heard through neighbors that she'd left the city, that she was working somewhere quiet, under a different name. No more photos, no more followers. Just silence. And perhaps that was its own kind of justice, not punishment, but emptiness. She had carved others out of her life to feel powerful, and in the end carved herself out too. One evening, I stood by the window as the sun set gold pouring through the curtains. I made 2 cups of tea, one for myself, one for memory. The wind through the trees outside carried the scent of jasmine, and I smiled not because I'd won, but because I had survived. The world had changed, and so had I. I had learned that power does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers from the quiet endurance of a heart that refused to disappear. She didn't destroy them, truth did. And in her silence she found her peace again.